If you ache for truth, goodness, and beauty, if you're hungry for a Christianity with substance and strength, if you long for a faith that's big and bold and biblical and all about Jesus Christ, if you're inspired by the idea of one church that has spanned 20 centuries, 24 time zones, and 2 hemispheres, enfolding every race, nation, and language, then you're considering Catholicism.
Okay, Cory, we just had like a 5-minute break from the previous episode.
I feel refreshed.
That's right.
Yes.
Now, for some of you, you're just clicking this in Spotify or whatever, and you didn't listen to the previous episode. So I highly encourage you to go back and listen to the previous episode, because this is part 2 of a conversation about the topic of development of doctrine. So just to do a segue, let me just say, but you need to go back and listen to it. In Catholicism, we have what's what I'm trying to say? A concept that church teaching, doctrinal teachings, can not evolve, not be made up, but that they mature. I like the word maybe mature rather than develop. Well, develop is what it is, but they mature, they grow. So the example of an acorn becomes a mighty oak tree, a fetus becomes a full-grown human being, right? Make sense? These things mature over time. And so we gave examples in the last episode of how, in Scripture we can see there's a Father and there's a Son and there's a Holy Spirit, but it took centuries for the doctrine of the Trinity to be fully sort of unpacked. And this is against, the notion either fundamentalism, that everything is just sort of in black and white in some Bible verse and that's all it is. Or on the other hand, you have people just making stuff up, right? But between that is the Catholic notion that the Scriptures, the good deposit given to the apostles, that all that has over time matured. And it continues to mature and grow. Our understanding of God, our understanding of the Scriptures, our understanding of doctrines and dogmas matures over time. You want to add anything?
No, I think that's a pretty good summary. Last time we went over some classic examples of the development of doctrine, the Trinity, Christology, who is the person of Jesus Christ, the Marian dogmas, things that are pretty well settled, and that there's something in the deposit of faith in Scripture and in apostolic tradition about them, but that it just took time and wrestling and discussion for the church to put it down precisely in black and white.
So one of the other points that we made at the end of the last time, the last episode, is that there are some criteria that get applied to this. And,
yes.
We talk about, who wrote about this, Cardinal Newman, others. But the point is that these criteria, and I'm going to rattle them off again here real fast. Anyone who wants to hear more about it, go back. That any kind of a doctrine that evolves or matures, there has to be a preservation of type. So it sort of keeps the essential character of the doctrine. It just gets more of that, to your point, or Chesterton's point that you cited. A puppy doesn't grow into a cat. An acorn doesn't produce coconuts, doesn't grow into a coconut tree. Continuity of principles, so it stays true to the foundational principles of Christ and Christianity. It doesn't grow into weird things. Power of assimilation, that it can sort of take on new ideas and cultures, but not losing the essential character. We talked about logical sequence, so you see that any development of doctrine doesn't just come out of nowhere. A leads to B, the thigh bone leads to the shin bone, or however that goes, right?
Yes.
That you can see how we got here. Someone doesn't just come along and say, hey, I got an idea, let's do this. Anticipation of the future, that you kind of see how early on in the beginning in the church, it was pointing this direction. We're sort of on a trajectory, right?
Yep.
Conservative action upon the past, so it takes earlier teachings and just unpacks and strengthens them, and finally was, I like the phrase, chronic vigor, right? It's got staying power.
Yep.
It lasts. It's not a one-hit wonder idea, right?
Yep.
So now what I want to do is talk about 5 ideas that are running around the church world, both outside the Catholic Church and inside the Catholic Church. And what I want to do is apply this development of doctrine concept to them to sort of see how it works in real time. Because I think if you went back in a time machine to the 400s or the 300s or other periods during time, right, earlier centuries, when the arguments about the Trinity or the arguments about the nature of Christ were going on, or other things, you would find bishops, theologians, popes articulating things on these, talking about these things, holding councils on these things, writing, all of that. And there was a sort of a process by which you got to the finished product. Make sense?
Yep.
And many times those took not just years or decades, it took centuries to sort of work out. And so the ideas I want to throw out now are things that are being talked about in the church world today, in the Christian world today, and we may be living in the middle of that process of working them out. And some of them may be moving towards legitimate development of doctrine, and some of them may be heading for the dustbin of history. You with me? Yep. So here's the 4, actually the 5, that we'll throw out. Now, the first 2 are things that recent popes have advocated for. And this is something I've got to say to my non-Catholic listeners. One of your biggest fears is, if you're not a Catholic and you're afraid of becoming Catholic, is that a pope will just decide to wave his hand and make something true because he just said so. The pope just said so. And the pope does have, teaching power, but popes just don't make stuff up, okay? We have 2 ideas that recent popes have argued are evolving or developing or maturing in the church. And the one is the church's teaching on capital punishment, and the other is the church's teaching on just war, okay? And I'm going to turn this to you, Cory, in a second to talk about how you apply these criteria. But let me just tee up the ball. With respect to capital punishment, the church has taught over the centuries that it is, that the state, the civil state, has legitimate power to exercise capital punishment, the death penalty. In fact, I know some people are going to say this because it's all over the internet. The Vatican City State, the Papal States, up until very recently had an executioner on their payroll. Because if you got caught committing murder in Rome in the 19th century, the Papal States had capital punishment. So you can't just say, well, the church has never taught it, or the church has never said it's legitimate, but we have recent popes saying things have matured, and at this point it's no longer admissible to practice, okay? And that's come out in recent papal documents. And the second one like that is just war. So Thomas Aquinas, well, going back to Augustine unpacked this whole thing about when a war is considered legitimate, just, and when it's not, and criteria for it. And then Thomas Aquinas unpacked that further, and other thinkers have. If you want to ask whether a country can go to war or use military action, here's the criteria, 1, 2, 3, 4. And now we have recent popes saying, yeah, not so much. The whole idea of just war doctrine is no longer, the most recent one was Pope Leo just recently in his new encyclical said it is, quote, his word was outdated. And you have a lot of people who are reading the new encyclical going, wait a minute, did he just wave his hand and say 2,000 years back to Augustine of just war doctrine is now just outdated? I don't want to argue just war or capital punishment here. I just want to now turn it over to you, Cory, and talk about how do we sort out whether these are legitimate developments of doctrine along the lines of what we've been talking about this evening,
Mhm.
or not? And how does the church work that out?
Yeah, so these two, it makes a lot of sense to present them together because they are coming from a very similar set of principles, or I think you could even say the same exact set of principles, which is when is violence acceptable, um, if it ever is. And so that is a prudential, moral decision or reasoning that the church is trying to make based on principles from the gospel. And so we have the principle of, say a preference for peace. Blessed are the peacemakers. We have, of course, like the commandment, thou shalt not kill in the Old Testament, which probably doesn't mean you must never kill, but there's an obvious preference for not killing if possible. But you also have the principle of the legitimacy of self-defense, violence and self-defense, violence to protect the weak. And so what the church has tried to do in different times and places is make a prudential decision about how and when violence can be used. And so, the example of the death penalty, when is it, if ever, legitimate to commit violence against someone who has committed a crime, whether murder or some other serious crime that endangers innocent people. And so you could argue that it's acceptable because you're doing it in order to protect others. Similarly, with the idea of a just war, you might be arguing that violence is legitimate in this case because a country is defending itself or a people is, trying to stave off invasion or threat of genocide or something like that. That in those cases, violence is legitimate. And again, I'm not, just like you, I'm not here to try and make an argument one way or the other, but these are prudential decisions. They're not like, is Jesus God or is Jesus not God? Or, are there three co-equal persons in the Trinity or aren't there? It's taking moral principles and trying to apply them to the situation on the ground. So like what recent popes have done is say, well, wars used to be fought in formations with bows and arrows or muskets or things like that. And it's one thing to try and develop a theory of just war. They were fought by, very clear different parties, states. Nowadays, we have nuclear weapons. We have bioweapons. We have chemical warfare. We have artificial intelligence. We have drones. We have all of these things. We have, non-state actors. It can become very unclear sometimes who is fighting whom and who has a legitimate authority in a given jurisdiction. And so a lot of what has been argued is that we have new situation, new conditions on the ground, and we need to apply those principles. We were talking about the continuity principles. We have the same principles, but we need to apply them to a new situation. And so again, that's not to argue one way or the other. Now, we do have, as Catholics, a moral obligation to submit our, religious submission of intellect and will to the Magisterium, to the Pope and to our bishop, which doesn't mean that we just turn our brains off, but, we have to defer to some extent to, like you said, Pope Leo's judgment on these things. But that doesn't mean that the overall, doctrinal debate just gets shut down. Like you'd said before, that's part of the genius of the Catholic Church, is that we work these things out until we figure them out, until the church can articulate them clearly.
Yeah, I'm kind of looking at the clock here, and I don't want to turn this into an episode about the death penalty or just war. I have a lot of thoughts about those. If we wanted to do an episode on those or on each of those, we could probably do a whole episode. And I have a ton of thoughts on both of those. Maybe those will be episodes in the future. But be that as it may, you talk about prudential judgment. Not everything is dogmatic,
right?
But there's still doctrines. We do have a doctrine of just war. We do. This is the Catholic social teachings, Catholic applications, and so they are. They're certainly not dogmatic teachings, but they are evolving doctrinal guidelines. And I think that you're on the right track when you say, and when we look at the criteria for development of legitimate development doctrine, you're absolutely right that you can see in seed form and acorn form in the gospel, the preference for peace, as you articulated it, against violence. But a lot of people, including doctors of the church like Thomas Aquinas, have pointed out the contrary. They've said, well, okay, in Romans 13, Paul says God gives the state, the magistrate, the power of the sword to punish evildoers. And that's why you do have doctors of the church, and the teaching of the church up until the 19th century was that, for example, capital punishment or just war is legit. So the issue, and it's not just something that a couple of people on social media have been saying. I mean, serious Catholic scholars, serious Catholic scholars and theologians have questioned when Pope Francis or Pope Leo says this, whether this is a development or a rupture. Because, one of the criteria that we talked about was the logical sequence. And you go, okay, if you're going along here and you're saying the church teaches capital punishment is legitimate, under certain circumstances, or military action is legitimate if the following criteria is met, and you have that teaching for 1,500 years, and then all of a sudden you go, oh, no, we're going another direction. I'm not saying that's true or not. I'm just saying there's people who are asking questions, and they're asking questions because they're trying to apply this criteria. Is this a legitimate development, or is it a break or an rupture? And
right, and it also depends pretty heavily on what you're actually arguing. I mean, it's one thing to argue the death penalty is always and everywhere evil, and another thing to argue, we really shouldn't be doing this for reason X, Y, and Z.
Well, yeah, and the other question is, right, is it a rupture, and are you contradicting earlier things? And here's where I want to go. I don't want to talk about those two anymore, other than to say the very fact that you have this kind of back and forth about it, I think, is an illustration of how development of doctrine happens in practice. We may look back 50 years from now or 100 years from now and go, yep, that's where it was going, and the Catholic Church settled it, and there's no more capital punishment, there's no more just war theory, and we started to see it in the early 20th century, or what are we in now? 21st? Are we in 21st? We started to see it in the early 21st century. We started to see popes like Pope Francis and Pope Leo XIV started to articulate these things in their encyclicals, and there was a lot of hullabaloo, and over time it's settled, and it's now settled. And then we may say that 50 years from now or 100 years from now, or not. So I think this is a good example, and it's a good example of how people are trying to apply those 7 criteria. Make sense?
Yeah.
Now, let's talk about 3 other things that are also floating around the Christian world and around the Catholic world, where people are arguing that these ought to be legitimate developments of doctrine. And the 3 that we're thinking are, should we have female priests? Okay. Should we have same-sex unions? And should people in irregular marriages, that's kind of a euphemism, right, for people who are divorced and remarried without an annulment, should they be able to receive communion? And let's talk with the last one first, because that one's interesting.
I literally could not do this without you, because this show is 100% listener supported. There are no ads, no sponsors. So if the episodes are helping you to understand the faith, to answer your questions, or draw you closer to historic Catholic Christianity, would you consider becoming a patron? For as little as $5 a month, you'll get every regular episode organized into topical playlists, plus exclusive bonus content, extra conversations, video Q&As, deep dives, live streams, behind the scenes, and more. Just head to patreon.com/considering Catholicism or tap the link in the show notes. Together, we're educating, equipping, and exciting people about the beauty of the Catholic faith.
Pope Francis, in one of his encyclicals, Amoris Laetitia, hinted at that. And I don't want to get into the whole Amoris Laetitia debate again, but he hinted at it. There was phrases and this and that, and there were things he said on the airplane, and then he had people around him and bishops saying, well, maybe you should think about this, and we should have a synod on the family, and it never came about. Okay. But there were a lot of noises about it. And people are saying, okay, and I know you know that at the time that was happening, you had people saying, well, this is what the Pope wants, and we have to give religious submission to the Pope, and this is what Pope Francis, where he seems to be going, so this is where we're going now. Now the divorced and remarried without an annulment can get communion. And other people said, well, hold on, just because the Pope wants it doesn't mean he gets it. And we went back and forth, and it looks like Leo is saying, yeah, that's not going to happen. So again, I think that's a case of the back and forth in which these things get settled. Why don't you comment on that?
Yeah, I think, again, it depends on the one that I keep coming back to as far as the criteria is the continuity of principles, although, of course, all of these come into play, is that what principles are we operating under here? The principles for this are primarily that, marriage is indissoluble. That's settled. That ship has sailed. That someone who is guilty of mortal sin should not be receiving Holy Communion, because again, we see that in seed form in like the letters of St. Paul, where he talks about not receiving the Lord's body and blood unworthily. And so we are in a situation in the modern industrialized world where we have a lot of people who, have divorced and have gotten into new relationships and would like to receive Holy Communion, and the church has to make a decision about that. And so what has to be figured out is, what do they have to do in order to be back in a state of grace in order to receive communion? You have those sort of inviolable principles. And so, what has typically been what's said is that you need to be in a situation where you're not continually committing that sin, where you're, even if, the previous marriage has broken down, you're not in an active sexual relationship in the current union, not to get too, specific about these things, that you're repenting of your sin, these kinds of things.
Right.
The new idea was that maybe you didn't have to do any of that in order to receive Holy Communion. And that's what's being debated about. I think that would be a clear example of, discontinuity of the principle, that you're now just violating the older principle of you can't be legitimately receiving Holy Communion if you're in an objective state of mortal sin.
Yeah.
But that's where the debate comes in.
Well, obviously I agree with you, and Pope Leo the 14th agrees with us. So, hey, we're a good company, right? Because
and John Paul before him. Yeah.
Yeah. So Pope Leo basically has shut down this whole thing. And actually, Pope Francis took this to the Synod on the Family and all that, and he kind of got shut down there, although the vote was kind of close. It was like, a 52-48 vote or something, but it got shut down. So it's not going anywhere. And I don't want to debate it, but the reason I brought it up is I thought it was an interesting example of how even a pope says, well, I'm speculating about these things. And he speculated about them, and he, sought the advice of the bishops, and he put it out there. And we're seeing now how the magisterium and the hierarchy reflected on that. And how a subsequent pope, because it generally all these things isn't going to be like one guy just comes up with it. It's going to be successive over time. And Leo has said, okay, we toyed with this idea. Pope Francis toyed with it, but it's not going anywhere. Okay. And I think, again, this is really, I personally think this is healthy. I think this is how, if we could go back in a time machine and see how things happened 1,500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, whatever, 500 years ago, we would see that there was a lot of this kind of back and forth, and that's how the church settled these matters. And it's actually a sign of the church's health and strength that the Catholic Church...
it's a sort of growing pain. Like it's messy, but it's really unavoidable if we're going to better understand Revelation and better live it out.
And that's a good segue to the next two examples, because, we love to quote Chesterton in here all the time. And Chesterton talked about some of these things where he said, well, we have to go with the times, go with the flow, right? People are saying, this is where things are going. We have to go with the flow. And Chesterton has this bomber of a quote where he says something like, people say we should go with the flow or go with the current of the age or whatever. He said, only dead things go with, how you remember how that quote goes? Only dead things go with the current. Like you throw a dead log or a
Right.
dead bird or a dead dog in the river, and
it just goes downstream. Yeah.
Right. It goes, living things swim against the current. And the Catholic Church is a living thing. And that brings us to two other things, which is female clergy and same-sex unions. Now, we can look at some of our brothers and sisters in the broader Christian world. In, say, the Anglican Church, we can look in a lot of our Protestant churches and say their perception, their argument is that Christianity has developed and evolved. I lived through this in my Calvinist denomination, the Christian Reformed Church, where we said, well, we didn't allow female pastors, ordained female clergy, but over time we came to realize that the Spirit is moving us, and over time the Spirit is moving us to develop our teaching on this. And the Anglicans argue that. A lot of the other Protestant denominations have argued that. And there's a lot of people in the Catholic Church who have advocated for it, including some priests and bishops. So let's apply this criteria that we're doing about development doctrine. The Catholic Church hasn't gone for it. And even Pope Francis said, ain't going to happen. Pope Leo has said, ain't going to happen. We're not going to have female priests. So why? Cory, just let's apply this whole development of doctrine concept to this, because our Protestant brothers and sisters say that's legitimate development of doctrine. Some Catholics think it should be. Why isn't it?
Yeah, well, I think you could hit all 7 of the criteria for legitimate development here, and it would get a big red X on all of them. But the ones that come to mind are the power of assimilation. I don't think it checks this box in the sense that a true development absorbs only that which is in accord with the gospel, which what came before. We see that for 2,000 years, that Christ instituted the episcopacy and the priesthood. He called men to be his priests, and that has happened throughout the history of the church without exception in the Catholic Church. And, there's the call to absorb this idea from, other Christian groups, or the idea of sort of the sameness. We're not talking about the equality. We believe in the equality of the sexes, but sort of the sameness of the sexes. That's a secular idea, an attempt to assimilate that into the church, but that is not in accord with what we've been taught in Revelation, and so that doesn't jibe. Or the conservative action upon its past, where a legitimate development will not reverse or remove a previous teaching or decision, but only bring it forward. It would be an obvious contradiction or reversal to say first that the priesthood is male and then that the priesthood is co-ed. This would simply be a reversal. So it fails on that ground. And it's a little premature to talk about chronic vigor or not, because this debate has only been going on for less than 200 years. But it's a new idea. It really didn't exist in any Christian denomination before that. And I think it's a pretty reasonable bet to say that it's not going to stand the test of time. That's
200 years.
Speculative, of course, but
heck, 200 years, you're talking 40. I mean,
yeah, I mean, like you have some
that,
radical groups in the 19th
well,
century.
Yeah, but you didn't have any mainline legitimate, denomination that had women clergy until within my lifetime, certainly within my career, because I saw it happen. So I think, on that point. And I'm so tempted right now to go down all the arguments against women clergy. And again, I didn't want to turn this episode. No, I mean, I don't mean that in a nasty way, but I think there's really good reasons why the Catholic Church doesn't do that and isn't going to change on that. But it's interesting, because when you look around and you say, okay, well, everybody else is doing it, why isn't the Catholic Church? You go, well, again, Catholic Church is judging that as not a legitimate development. Now, let's take on the last one, which is same-sex union, same-sex marriage, call it what you want. And let's be really honest here. We have huge segments of the Catholic Church that want this. So the Bishops' Conference of Germany has gone all in on we want gay marriage and we want female priests.
Mhm.
So this is not just something like, well, that's a crazy idea, because I mean, you've got tons of bishops, and in the last couple of synods, it certainly didn't pass, but there were maybe 25 or 30% of the bishops that voted for it. So when you've got something that you go a third of your bishops globally are in favor of, it's not like just some wackadoodle thing that's out there. It's something that is pushing against. And what we're seeing, I think this is such a great example of how development of doctrine works, both in the positive and the negative, is that you see the popes, you see Rome pushing back. Right now, you're seeing Pope Leo moving towards disciplining those bishops that have been advocating some of these ideas. And so you can go back in time to the Arian controversy when it seemed like all the bishops of the world were Arians, right? And there was only a very small number that said no. And so I think we can look at the whole same-sex marriage, same-sex union thing as something where it doesn't matter if you've got some priests and some bishops and some others advocating for something. You've got people in the pews advocating for it. You've got a couple of celebrity priests like Father Martin running around, right? But the thing is at the end of the day, the church is judging this not to be a legitimate development.
Yeah, and I mean, I think both with this, with the idea of same-sex unions and with the idea of female priesthood, what people sometimes will forget is that this has already been definitively declared upon. This is dogmatic at this point. And so at this point, if you're making the argument for these things, you're actually making an argument against settled dogma, because back in the reign of St. John Paul II, like, he definitively declared, using his papal infallibility, that the church had no authority to ordain women to the priesthood, or the fact that the form and matter of the sacraments, including marriage, has been dogmatically defined, and that's not recent. That's very, very ancient teaching. That, you know, the matter, the physical material that you need to confect the sacrament of marriage is one male human and one female human. That's been dogmatically defined. And so if you're arguing the opposite, you're violating that principle of conservative action upon the past, that you don't reverse or remove previous definitively taught statements. You would be, in this case, if you change that. You'd be violating that principle of preservation of type, of taking, a thing, marriage, which is a man and a woman making a covenant that's a sacramental, grace-infused thing, and turning it into something that it's not, either two men or two women doing that, because those are, that's different. A different thing, like a dog and a cat, are different things. And not to get too granular about it, I think it's also a clear violation of that principle of the logical sequence, because, the church's teaching about marriage follows from both, revelation and natural law principles of, what, God's creation of man and woman, what man and woman are, all of the sexual ethical teachings of the church. All of these things follow logically into a sequence that precludes that conclusion that marriage could be between two people or however many, that aren't one man and one woman. And so you would be violating the criteria for development on that front as well.
Said, as we're nearing the end of our time on this one, I'm going to throw out one bonus that we aren't really going to unpack at length tonight, but maybe it's a teaser for a future follow-up episode, okay? When we talk about what can and can't legitimately develop in the church and what can and can't legitimately change.
Oh, goodness, I don't know what you're going to say either.
What's that?
I don't know what you're going to say, so this should be interesting.
Priestly celibacy.
Okay.
So right, priestly celibacy in the Catholic Church is a discipline. And there are some non-celibate priests in the church. So there are some married Catholic priests that came in, like, for example, under Benedict, when he allowed a lot of Anglican clergy to come in. And the priestly celibacy wasn't really settled until the Middle Ages, and then later at Trent and these things. The discipline of Catholic priests not being married was a discipline that was imposed, not a dogmatic doctrine. And just as we had so Benedict let in married Anglican priests, so there are married Catholic priests running around.
And there are married priests in the Eastern traditions,
and
the Eastern
married,
Catholic churches.
right. Yeah. And if Leo continues to, and I hope he does, continues to work towards some kind of, I don't want to say reunification, but some kind of accord with the Eastern Orthodox churches, you could see more crossover in that. So I think it's the kind of thing that can evolve over time. It's conceivable that in the future, the discipline of priestly celibacy, unmarried priests, could develop or evolve. I'm not saying it would. I'm not even saying it should, because personally I'm not in favor of it, but it could. But that would be a different thing because it's not a dogma. It's not revealed.
Yeah, and we've alluded to that a few times, both in this conversation and the previous one, that like there are different kinds of teachings. We did an episode ages ago about, sort of the different levels or types of teachings in the Catholic Church. Go ahead.
No. Well, I was just going to say, if I was going to say, I lost this train of thought because I'm getting old. Right? When you talk about whether something was in Acorn form in the scriptures, right, in terms of your criteria, what's interesting, right, is you had St. Peter, the founding apostle, who was married. St. Peter was married, as were some of the other apostles. Paul writes that in one of his letters. How come the other apostles get to be married? And so it's hard to argue that priestly celibacy is in Acorn form in the scriptures when at least Peter, the first pope, wasn't. So that's why it's never been declared a dogma.
Yeah, and again, if we ever want to do an episode on that in particular, we can get into the details. But you also have the fact that from the earliest ages of the church, bishops or priests who are married have generally either lived separately from their wives or lived in a situation of continence with their wives. So there was sort of an expectation of celibacy even within marriage for clergy. And so you have in apostolic tradition a seed of that discipline. But again, like you said, a discipline is a lot different than a doctrine and certainly than a dogma about, the nature of God or something.
Well, I don't want anybody to misunderstand me. I'm not like subtly arguing for it because I have been a married clergyman, a married pastor. And what I can tell you is having, have a wife and raising children while being a pastor, I can't imagine just from an experiential standpoint, when I look at what our priests, the demands that are on our priests, I can't imagine that would be a good idea for a lot of reasons. I think our priests, I think the doctrine of priestly celibacy is a wonderful thing for a lot of reasons, and I think it's practical and yada yada. But so I'm not trying to stealthily argue for it. I'm just trying to say when we look at things like, well, can you have female priests? Can you have same-sex unions? Can you have this? To your point, there's different categories of these things, and the whole point of this episode or these conversations tonight was to talk about how doctrine develops legitimately and what is and isn't legitimate development.
Yep.
So okay, I'm gonna call it here because the episode's getting long and the conversation's getting late. Cory, this is really good. We're gonna need to follow up with a couple of these topics clearly and do some follow-up episodes because we've left some stuff on the table that we didn't fully unpack. But this was super helpful. And you with Cardinal, is it Saint? They always call him Cardinal Henry Newman instead of just Henry Newman. I mean, it's kind of weird.
Yeah, I mean, because when, during his lifetime, he was a cardinal, and so that would have been the form of address. And so some people affectionately continue to call him Cardinal Newman.
Like Colonel like Colonel Sanders or something, right?
Yeah. Well, it's a little bit like how, today we're recording on the feast of St. Paul VI.
Right.
People say Pope St. Paul VI. It's like Pope isn't his name, but it's what he was called when he was alive. So
well, anyway, Saint Cardinal John Henry Newman, Doctor of the Church, talking
Hair
about
doctor.
Hair Doctor, unpack this whole concept, the doctrine of development of doctrine, and he's your confirmation saint. And this has been a great couple of conversations about it. I'm sure it'll prompt more questions, and we need to have some follow-up. But thank you, Cory, for your time, and I know you've got a family waiting for you.
Shush. All right. Well, thanks, Greg.
All right. Good night. We'll talk soon. Okay.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
We'll be back with another episode very soon. And this show is 100% listener supported. My patrons keep the lights on, and they let me spend more time researching and recording so that these episodes keep coming. If this show has helped you, would you consider becoming a patron? For as little as $5 a month, you'll get every regular episode organized into topical playlists, plus exclusive bonus content, extra video Q&As, deep dive courses, live streams, and more. Just head to patreon.com/Considering Catholicism or tap the link in the show notes. And would you please rate the podcast on whatever platform you're using and write a review on Apple Podcasts or on ConsideringCatholicism.com. And you can drop me a line. Patrons can comment directly on Patreon posts or Spotify. I read every one. Or you can always use the contact form at ConsideringCatholicism.com, or you can email me at ConsideringCatholicism@gmail.com. I love hearing your questions, your comments, and your stories.